we're going to move past that probably rather quickly here. So reviewing the current conditions, I think I would be remiss if I didn't show this beautiful tropical depression over eastern or western Indiana here that I had the pleasure of driving through from Gary through Lafayette. Obviously took on some great structure, but to have a tropical system at the end of May in the Midwest, that's something to point out here. So definitely great conditions there. So let's go ahead and get in and get started with our temperature and precipitation conditions here. So we're looking at May temperature recap. The contiguous U.S. on a whole had its warmest May on record. And as you can see here, every state in our region, obviously, was close to or in the top 5. We had several record warmest locations from Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri. And we've been talking about this now for the last few weeks, but this is a complete reversal, obviously, from the conditions we saw in April. And so this was the April map that I kept on from the last webinar, and you can see many states went from their coldest or second coldest to certainly their top 5 warmest Mays. So it's quite an impact, quite a reversal that's led to some additional impacts throughout the region, and we'll get into those as we move forward. Looking at the precipitation, as it usually is, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag of conditions across our region. We can point out some of the wetter areas from Nebraska out to Wyoming and Montana. So these are certainly up in the upper echelon of the wettest months, Mays on record, with above average conditions there, and then also closer to the lakes there in Wisconsin and Michigan. 2 states stand out for the May recap on dryness with below average precipitation anyway, and that's Indiana and Colorado. Again, leading to the fires there out in Colorado and some drier conditions elsewhere. If we look at the white shaded states, much of the other, the other states here, some of them, it's really varying from, kind of the middle of the pack to toward the upper part of the pack. But again, these are closer to near average for the May precipitation. Since we're in June, we can look back at the climatological spring here, and if you were to look at the top left panel, you see the most of the region, and I put near average in quotations here because certainly this, as we've already mentioned, was nowhere, or I should say not really near average isn't a very good characteristic of that, obviously with a lot of ups and downs, but on average for March through May, in terms of the rankings, conditions were near average for the record. Once you get out to the western portions of the region from, again, Nebraska into Colorado, certainly Colorado, and then Wyoming, these were much above to much above average conditions there. And again, the remaining states near average. If we look at precip here in the bottom right panel, a couple interesting patterns here. So the bookends, Montana and Ohio, saw above average precipitation for this period. Many of the central states in a line from Montana there through Ohio, kind of near average in terms of their ranks for spring. And then if we focus on the other 2 areas here, if we look at the upper Great Plains, North Dakota, Minnesota, showing for the time period below average, but there's been some recent improvement, I would say, in those regions. But our southern 3 states here from Colorado, Kansas, and Missouri, below average precipitation for the entire period, and certainly that's led to the conditions that we're going to see as we move forward here from here. So a little bit more recently now, the last 30 days, and this is the departure from normal temperature, and normal being delineated from 1981 to 2010, and this is for the period of May 21st through the 19th of June. We can see the entire region here for our region above normal across the entire region. And many of these areas are in excess of 6 degrees Fahrenheit in terms of above their average temperatures. And so the core of that really lines up with the central plains here from South Dakota down through Minnesota, western Minnesota, northwest Iowa, eastern Nebraska, and northeast Kansas here. So along with this, obviously, came a lot of record temperatures. We got reports of a lot of heat. Obviously, the Omaha heat wave here, 97 to 101 degrees from Friday through Monday. We heard from Aberdeen, South Dakota, state climatologist there. Aberdeen has hit 100 degrees 2 times already, which that's a little bit unusual for this period of time. So to follow that thread, these are daily record temperatures, more focused in the Midwest from the Midwest Regional Climate Center, but it's the first 2 weeks of June and the first 4 days of this week. I think it's pretty interesting to see a lot of the record highs and record lows were really focused in the Iowa, Missouri region the first couple of weeks. We actually had some cooler weather out in the east in Ohio, cooler weather during the first part of June than we had all of May. And then you really see as that heat dome toward the west or southwest part of our country expanded a little bit. The first 4 days of this week, we've seen quite a number of record high minimums, and also sites that have reached both of those records. And so really kind of shows that we've got a lot of heat out there. We've got a lot of high heat indices, heat indices rather. Just to point out one, we had a record here in Dayton, Ohio, where we hit a dew point of 81 degrees Fahrenheit 3 times within the day, and that's pretty soupy there for us out in Ohio. So we don't do that very often. I think that the last time that happened at that site in Dayton was 1959, so it's been quite a while since we've seen a dew point that high. So looking at the precipitation over the last 30 days, and I kind of want to, I think, start out west. I mean, obviously precipitation is a lot more variable, and it can be variable within the state as well. We see that, very low totals here in the upper left panel from Colorado and into parts of Kansas and Nebraska, extending up into South Dakota as well. We see from Kansas eastward into northern Missouri, where we've got some very little precipitation falling in those regions. And then we kind of jump over across northern Indiana and up into Michigan as well. And looking at the bottom right panel, this is the percent of normal for the last 30 days. So we can see a lot of deep reds, dark reds here, indicating less than 50 and certainly less than 25% of normal precipitation throughout many parts of Missouri, Colorado, and Kansas as well. Some areas even dipping down below that as well. We also will point out parts of South Dakota here and maybe the far stretches of North Dakota, kind of this dry pocket with wetter than normal precipitation surrounding it as well. So this is kind of a growing area of dryness in our region. There have been wet areas as well. We see this across much of the UP and Michigan, northern Wisconsin, and into Minnesota as well, extending down into northern Iowa, certainly northern Illinois. So Rockford, for instance, is another situation of heavy rainfall this week, and then down into eastern Illinois and southern Indiana. So obviously with the rainfall differences across the region, we're really going to be able to pick up these intense wet and dry areas on the stream flows, and that's certainly what we see here. So there's a lot of things to point out from this. We can see very low stream flows over much of Colorado, and dry extending there across southern and eastern Kansas, extending northeast up across northern Missouri, and we'll talk a little bit more about some water issues coming out of that region. On the flip side, we see the wet conditions, so a lot of blues and greens, which are indicated normal to above normal stream flows for this time of the year. We see that from northern Kansas extending up through northwest Iowa into Minnesota and Wisconsin. And we've got some flooding taking place, for instance, in southwest Minnesota today. And then also these events, these high precipitation events, for instance, around the UP in northern Wisconsin and Rockford, Illinois, you see some black dots here indicating high flows for this time of the year. Also want to point out the stream flows across Montana and then down the Missouri River as well. So we've got much above normal stream flows in this region, and due to a combination of snow melt and the heavy precipitation. And so these are going to become, obviously these are issues standing in our region here. So we can jump to soil moisture, and this is somewhat similar to the patterns that we're seeing, but a little bit different. We see obviously the anomalies, or compared to average, these deficits that are taking place across northern Missouri, should say eastern Kansas, northern Missouri, southeast Iowa, and western Illinois. So we see the darker reds and oranges there. We still have the soil moisture up across the northern Great Plains, Minnesota, Dakotas, that are showing negative anomalies there as well. And again, to point out, because of the snow melt and the precipitation, so we have these wet anomalies across Montana, Wyoming, parts of Nebraska, and then extending into the wet areas we've seen near the lakes. So a lot of these evidence is coming together to really tell a good picture of our region. Another thing we like to look at certainly is the evaporative demand across the region. And to kind of summarize, evaporative demand this time of the year is very high, and for our region, it is above average in terms of what we're seeing. So with the high heat, certainly demand is high across western and central Colorado. That's indicated here on the map, showing these ED4 categories, or 98th percentile, in terms of how strong that demand is, that leads to drying conditions, very rapidly drying conditions. So in areas that even receive rainfall this time of the year, the evaporation is very high, and so this we can get some short-term relief often with heavy rainfall, but not necessarily long-term because of the precipitation and the demand on that water. We also see the very low categories here from Kansas, Missouri, and then into western Illinois. This is kind of becoming a broken record, but we can see all the evidence coming together that these areas are indeed quite dry this year. And then we have this area that's expanding, and I pointed out the precipitation deficit kind of pocket there in the Dakotas, the northeast, South Dakota in particular. You can see the very high evaporative demand in that location as well. So these are areas that are a growing concern, and areas that we're going to have to continue to monitor as we move forward. So this morning we had the U.S. Drought Monitor released for conditions through June 19th on Tuesday here. So this is for the central region, our central region. And it lines up quite nicely with what we're seeing in the U.S. Drought Monitor, with all this evidence already presented. So we see our greatest categories are exceptional drought and extreme drought, kind of entrenched there across southern and western parts of Colorado, extending out into Kansas and northeast Kansas, and then into northern Missouri, extending into southeast Iowa and western Illinois. So we've got extreme drought there in eastern Kansas, severe drought certainly across parts of northern Missouri and southeast Iowa. Traveling from Columbus out here a couple of days ago to Nebraska City, it was quite evident that things were quite dry, and it was kind of neat to follow along with the drought monitor as we went county by county here. I also like to show here the drought monitor class change to really show how conditions have changed. So
over the last week.
Yeah, over the last week. So we've seen the changes, or conditions really remaining the same. Still the intense drought across Colorado. Maybe some slight improvement there in the southwest corner of Kansas, but conditions are still deteriorating in far eastern Kansas up into Missouri, western Illinois, and then again in that dry pocket region in eastern South Dakota. So these are the areas that are expanding. We're seeing more percentage of abnormally dry and then moderate drought categories in those regions. So on the flip side of that, we have seen some improvement across North Dakota, northwest South Dakota, and parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin as well. Okay, so that kind of is the end of the review of the conditions of late. So now we can turn to some of the impacts. This is a wonderful picture that was provided by Pat Ganon, who's the Missouri State climatologist. This is a picture of corn, I think at the University of Missouri. Rolled up quite tight, obviously kind of something that corn does. I'm not sure I've ever seen it rolled up quite this tight, and I think Pat referred to it as pineapple-ish corn. If they can perfect maybe a mix of corn and pineapple taste, that would be great. But certainly this video or this image is showing that these crops are quite stressed here. So we're going to take a look at the topsoil moisture. This is from the USDA's weekly report here, looking at topsoil. The top left is the percent surplus for the week ending June 17th. Generally speaking, there's only a few states with moderate level of surplus, those being Ohio, Minnesota, and Montana. Much of our region isn't really seeing a lot of surplus here in the category for topsoil moisture. And in fact, many states from Indiana, Illinois, Iowa have seen a little bit of decrease in that percent of surplus moisture in the topsoil. On the other side, percent of short to very short topsoil moisture here for the week shows that many of the states are increasing, or short to very short conditions continue or increasing across the region. So I draw the attention to places like Colorado, Kansas, Missouri, that continue to increase their percent to very short percent moisture. And we can even see some additions there into Nebraska and Illinois. So conditions in terms of the soil moisture, the topsoil moisture, aren't alleviating. In fact, they're kind of intensifying there across the southern states. So if we look at the progress on some of the crops here, I mean, corn obviously planted and most emerged across the entire region here, nearly all the corn. A little bit behind the 5-year average in Michigan, where it was very cold and wet for that period, but you can see most of the other states, percent emerged is quite high. And with the conditions, percent of good to excellent here, compared to the 5-year average, many of the states are above that. Pointing out again, Missouri, which is not, so it's actually, in fact, a 15% change here, really indicating the drought stress that's evident across Missouri. With soybean progress, a similar story. We're getting to the point where nearly all the soybeans have emerged or are close to that. Most of those are ahead of schedule, except for Michigan, and the percent of good to excellent is quite high for the eastern regions, from Illinois, Indiana, and then other states for Ohio, Iowa, Nebraska, and parts north. And again, with the stress on the soybean, we see a little bit of a decrease in the good to excellent conditions on the 5-year comparison for Kansas and Missouri as well. I also wanted to show pasture land this week, just because it's been a topic from some of the folks in Kansas and Missouri and other places as well. We generally have decent conditions across the north and the east, but with deteriorating conditions in terms of pastures from Colorado through Missouri, and that's shown by the orange color there, and the negative values, the decreasing values. The top left being compared to last week, the right being compared to last year. And so very similar patterns, significant negative impacts throughout the southern states of the region on pasture. So with all the dryness that we're seeing in different areas, we do see a lot of those impacts on the ag from the dry conditions. This is another picture out of Missouri looking at the corn stress. But some of the other things that are really critical reports that we hear are dealing with the ability to feed cattle. So these cold conditions that we had in March and April, a lot of hay was still being used to feed cattle, so very little carryover. And then the upcoming hay crop is low and short, and so there's some areas that are suffering from this. We've heard reports of sell-off and culling in terms of herds as well. And then with the heat, there's some stress on the livestock. Obviously, we heard about a lot of heat mortality in South Dakota. I mentioned the pasture land, so we've got these areas, Kansas and Missouri, where pastures are turning brown, and not generally great in other areas as well. A lot of reports about ponds being critically low in places like north central Missouri, southwestern Iowa. So folks are having to haul these impacts as well. I mentioned the dust storms at the top. Locally, it caused a lot of defoliation and some corn plants to be blown out. So this is another picture of that dust as well. And then kind of transition from our ag impacts, I mentioned conditions that are taking place in northern Missouri. We've got some cities there that are in water restrictions because of very low reservoir levels because of the dryness. And so that kind of transition we can see, it's not necessarily a direct ag impact, but impacting the cities as well with the long-term dryness that we're experiencing in those regions. So that's really going to get us now to kind of more of the water story here. And we're going to look at the mountain snowpack, perhaps the last for the season. If we go back, we can see that snowpack was quite high, above Fort Peck here on the left, and also Fort Peck to Garrison. So the snowpack was quite high and peaked in mid-April, but you see the rapid decrease in the snowpack with the warm conditions and some precipitation that we've had. So now we're close to complete melt here with very little in both of these regions. If we look at the Platte River, the mountain snowpack water content wasn't quite as high for the year, but again, it's a very similar story with this rapid snow melt and near complete or at complete for this as well. So with the warm temperatures and the rain-off, more than 90% of the snow has melted in both the reaches that I've shown. And the runoff then into Fort Peck and Garrison reservoirs will continue over the next couple of weeks because as the water comes down here. So what you're seeing on the right is from the Army Corps looking at current reservoir levels. Higher than average releases have been ongoing for the last several months, and these will continue. Releases from the Garrison Dam will be increased over 3 days from 52,000 to 60,000 CFS rate on June 23rd, that coming out today. Storage in the system should peak in early July, but we're told it will take 6 months with above average releases to evacuate all the stored floodwaters from the March to July high runoff period. So that's the conditions here in terms of runoff from these basins. Switching to current river flooding issues, we see a couple of regions. The Ohio River right now is not really experiencing a lot of flooding issues, so this is not included on the map. But these are our immediate significant river flood outlooks. We see some flooding ongoing or imminent in places in Montana, parts of North Dakota, and possible across South Dakota, and then here south in Nebraska City into far northwest Missouri. Again, I mentioned some flooding taking place in southwest Minnesota as well. We can see, because of the heavy rain that's been taking place across northern Wisconsin, there's significant river flooding occurring or imminent in this region as well. I want to take a look now at the Great Lakes temperatures, getting quite warm for the southern basins from Lake Erie, parts of Lake Ontario, southern Michigan, and Huron as well. So temperatures getting about 65 to 80 degrees in some cases, with much colder temperatures here, 40s and 50s across Lake Superior as we expect. One of the lakes in particular I want to point out is the Lake Erie and the harmful algal bloom predictions for this year. So these are based on really phosphorus loads from March to July, and the predictions are based on a combination of measurements through June 11th and river forecasts through July. So this year in the Western Basin region, we're expected to have a greater than the mild 2016 bloom that we had, but a smaller bloom than we had in 2017. So the load hasn't been quite as high, and that's going into the prediction here for Lake Erie in terms of the harmful algal blooms. I mentioned the fires that we're seeing out west, the 416 fire in southwest Colorado. As of this morning, 34,177 acres have burned, and this fire is 37% contained. There was some recent help from the remnants of Hurricane Bud that came up from the Pacific. That really helped contain a little bit more of this fire, jumping from about 18% last week to 37% this morning. And if you look at the significant wildfire potential here upcoming for July, we can see the monsoon, as it kicks in, is expected to help dampen that potential throughout July. So let's finally turn to the last piece here, which are the outlooks for this summer. And actually, we're going to look at the 7-day precipitation forecast, the 8 to 14-day outlook, look at July, the remainder of the summer and the growing season, and then talk about a little bit about the El Niño Watch. So on the 7-day quantitative precipitation forecast from the Weather Prediction Center here, and this is valid through next Thursday, June 28th. We have some interesting things to point out. You can see a lot of the blues and the purple and red color here across large portions of our region, which are indicating, in the precipitation forecast at least, the potential for some beneficial rainfall. And so we've got areas here, bullseye here in Kansas, western Kansas, it's still in the drought conditions. We can see that north-central Missouri extending into southwest or southeast Iowa. That is another region where we can pick up potentially 2 to 5, and then from northern Illinois into Indiana as well. So certainly, if this is to verify, it would help the case in terms of precipitation and the dryness that we're seeing in many of these regions. And so we can see that this the precipitation on the northern edge isn't quite as significant, which there's still some heavy rain expected or predicted here across Wyoming and parts of Montana that could continue to contribute to some of the significant flow there. So looking at the 8 to 14 day, this takes us to July 4th actually, and we can see the temperature probabilities on the left-hand side. A very, very strong signal here for above, higher confidence, 70%, 60% or greater above normal temperatures throughout much of our region. So a lot of this has to do with the dryness that we're indicating and talking about. We'll have to see how much the precipitation will mitigate that, but again, with evaporation being very high, that may not be the case, and so we've got a lot of high temperatures here that are really going to help. Yeah, so if we flip on to the far northwest part of our region here, though, there is an increased probability of below normal temperatures across Montana, and equal chances there from eastern Montana, far western North Dakota into Wyoming. On the precipitation side, on the right panel, there's a large area of, certainly above 33 or 40% probability of above normal precipitation. These are generally on the lighter side in terms of the probabilities, but it kind of fits the pattern that we've seen, which are these ridge runners around the heat dome, so the dry, hot weather, and then these storms riding along the periphery across much of the northern central region and into the Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio as well. Looking at the July probabilities, just released this morning from the Climate Prediction Center, we can see increased probabilities again of warmer than average temperatures for much of the region through July. If we start from, say, Minnesota, far eastern South Dakota, Nebraska, throughout the remainder of the eastern section of our region, with a little bit elevated probabilities there across eastern Kansas, Missouri, and western Illinois. This is likely a direct impact of the soil moisture that we're seeing, the dryness in that region as well. If we go on throughout much of the upper Great Plains, eastern Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, equal chances of above, below, until we get out into western Wyoming and western Montana, where those probabilities are increased once more. On the precipitation side, not a big, strong signal here throughout much of the region. On this prediction here, equal chances across most of the state. You see the growing or the increasing probability of above normal precipitation across Colorado. That's in response to the monsoon season that we're entering as well. And then perhaps some dryness sneaking in from the south. We'll have to see how this prediction changes as we move forward. The July to September, so the remainder of our summer here, equal chances across the upper Midwest and northern Great Plains, with increased probability of warmer than average conditions across much of the rest of the region. And again, a similar depiction here on the precipitation. We see the monsoon influence across Colorado and Wyoming, perhaps a little bit drier in western Montana, and equal chances over much of the remainder of our region as well. And I threw August and October in here. It's a very similar pattern, but I'm not going to belabor the point on here. Warmer than average, likely through many parts, and then equal chances in many others. So if we look at the drought outlook through September 30th, In the immediate term, we do see drought persisting in these areas from Colorado, Kansas, and Missouri, southeast Iowa, western Illinois. Perhaps the drought improves, but that really is going to depend on the precipitation and whether we see that verifying over the next couple of months. Quickly to get into our El Nino forecast, the latest forecast here, we are seeing an increase in the sea surface temperatures across the eastern Pacific. That's what the figures are showing here on the right. So we see warmer than average conditions in the equatorial Pacific, which is indicating perhaps that we're seeing a tendency toward warmer temperatures there and perhaps El Nino. We've seen that at the surface. We've also seen that in the subsurface of the oceans, and so there's some talk, there's been talk about what conditions are going to be like as we head in the upcoming season. So if we look at the probabilistic INSO outlook that was updated on the 14th, you can see, first of all, the lines you see are climatological probability of La Nina, neutral, or El Nino conditions. In the bars showing what the conditions are currently, the probability here. So as we go on, you see the gray bars decreasing, the red bars increasing as that probability of INSO or El Nino conditions grows. Yeah, so these are based on 3-month, INSO state based on the kind of the Central Pacific sea surface temperature anomaly for 3-month periods. So you see the May, June, July, the June, July, August periods. If you look at a little bit closer at the lines here, so the climatological probabilities of either El Nino or La Nina or neutral conditions are shown, and you can see how the probability, the forecast, the probabilistic INSO outlook is above that of climatology, and so that's where we see this growing El Nino conditions favored later and later into the season here once we get into the upcoming Northern Hemisphere winter. So there is an El Nino watch, but INSO neutral is favored through the Northern Hemisphere during our summer, and then increasing to perhaps 65% chance during our winter time. We'll have a lot more to say, I think, in later webinars as we continue to watch El Nino and whether it establishes and grows and what impacts that might mean for our region. So to wrap things up, our conditions, May's warmth really is carried over into June. Mention again the hard flip from the very cold April to the warm May, still having the impacts across the region on agriculture and water. As far as precipitation, we've seen areas that have received very heavy rainfall, obviously, but some areas that are missing out, in particular eastern Kansas, Missouri, western Illinois, southeast Iowa, as well as up into eastern South Dakota here. So plants, most of the corn and soybean are doing well across the state, but are stressed from the heat and more so in some regions. And we see some drought expansion across parts of Kansas, Missouri, and also South Dakota. Again, El Nino watch issued during the summer. We do have an elevated likelihood for warmer than average to wetter than average conditions in a lot of our region elevated likelihood for warmer than average conditions, but equal chances on the precip throughout much of the region as well. So no specific dryness in the outlooks, but we'll have to monitor these for changes. So that kind of brings the end of the presentation here. So you can find today's and past recorded presentations at the following links. Again, thanks to all of our partners, state climatologists, regional centers, and NOAA, and others. I do want to point out we have some upcoming webinars of note. The Southwest Drought webinar will be on Monday, June 25th. The link is provided here. And then the Southern Plains Drought webinar with Victor Murphy will be held on June 27th. You can follow that link here. So if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. Mine's on the title slide, or Dennis, Doug, and others that are more than welcome, or more than happy to answer your questions. So thank you, and thank you, Doug.
Thank you very much, Aaron. We're going to leave this up in case you want to write down those registrations. Again, those are other areas that we are focusing on, mainly for drought implications in the Southern Plains, the continuing drought in the Southern Plains, and then another discussion in the Southwest Four Corners, if you will, part of the country. We have several questions, or a few questions and a few comments to go through. Before we do, just want to point out, for those of you who may be confused a little bit by some of the depictions on some of the maps showing drought increasing over areas that got rain, please understand that the Drought Monitor cuts off sort of their rainfall, on Tuesday morning of each week, and so they don't consider much after that.
They don't consider anything. They cannot
consider
anything after that.
Yeah. They have to have a cutoff period, and then they put the map together. So the rains that we've gotten Tuesday, Wednesday, and this morning across the middle part of the country haven't been taken into account for that. The other thing I was going to say is the 7-day precipitation outlook, and maybe if you want to go back to that, it's pretty common for, we call it the QPF plot, if you will.
What does QPF
No,
stand for?
Go back. Or it's not on. Oh, there it is. Okay.
What does QPF stand for?
Right. There. So you can talk, Dennis. You're right on here. You can just say. It's a quantitative precipitation forecast, which means nothing to anybody. But what it really means is this is the amount of precipitation that could fall according to models and outlooks for the next 7 days. This is if you added it all up, according to the models, this is what you come out with. So I'm sure some of you have looked at this and had great hope in the past and been disappointed by the outcome. It would be maybe a flood of record if this happened, if this actually happened over that broad of an area. So please understand that this is a guesstimate of rainfall over 7 days. It's not necessarily what is actually, I hate to say not forecasted, but it's a pretty broad brush nationally of what could happen. It does indicate, however, where significant rains could happen, and
the more likely areas,
and are more likely in the heavier areas, right? But that could be off 50 or 100 miles too. So so I guess I'll leave it at that. One comment that was made a little bit earlier was that we had record-setting delays for the College World Series in Omaha due to the rain. And if you accumulate all the hours and delays of everything, it was 660 hours of delays that happened, and it's the most that's happened over the last 8 years for that. We had another question, or we had a question then from Benjamin Diamond. Can cotton conditions improve? And we're really talking about the southern plains into Kansas at this point. Can cotton conditions improve at any point during the growing season? And Dennis is going to answer that in a minute. But also, how about corn and soybeans? Are they more resilient than cotton? And I'll leave it up to Dennis to sort of take that question.
I get all the good ones. Cotton, I don't know if cotton can improve condition through the year. I would say by this point, probably not big changes are likely, but I don't have a whole lot of background on cotton, so don't take that to the bank. Are corn and beans more resilient than cotton? Corn it's reaching near its peak time right now, its reproductive period, that tasseling that people talk about. That's when the corn uses the most water, but it's most vulnerable to yield loss because of stress during that time period. Newer hybrids are less vulnerable, but it's still the most vulnerable time. Soybeans are much less vulnerable because they can kind of adapt over a longer period. So you have to have a fairly long stretch of stress to be able to impact soybeans overall. Okay.
Thank you, Dennis. There was a question about the Corps of Engineers increased releases from Oahe with the higher flows from Garrison that was mentioned earlier. And I don't have any data on that actually to say one way or the other. It is a substantial increase out of Garrison for sure. I imagine there will be follow-up information from the Corps on that shortly. That's unless Kevin Stom, you want to comment on that. If you do, raise your hand. If you don't. we'll get to it later. And then there's another question about El Nino in terms of, can you explain on basic terms the meaning of El Nino in terms of having an influence, mainly in the winter, on the north central part of the U.S. And yeah, sure, we can go into that now a bit. It's pretty much the flip opposite of what La Nina provides. So you remember last year, our winter was relatively cool and relatively wet, especially in Montana, in places around there, northern Rockies, and relatively dry in the southern Rockies. That's a good example of the difference in generally in El Ninos. That'll flip if El Nino happens. It's likely to flip, I should say. Thus, the northern mountains having less snow accumulation, and the southern parts of the nation anyway having a better shot at more precipitation. As you go further east into the basin, or further east into the Midwest and such, again, the northern part, if you will, for northern state or two will tend to be a little bit warmer than normal, and really the southern part of the Midwest and plains can go either way, as being a little bit cooler or near normal or even a little warmer. And there's just not a hard evidence one way or the other.
There's a signal in the Ohio Valley.
The Ohio Valley does tend to be drier, and sometimes that extends up into the Great Lakes as well. But again, those are more December, January, February, maybe November through March type times when that happens. Oh, take us off mute. All right. I'm going to get a little update here from the Corps of Engineers, so stand by. There we go. All right, Kevin, can you hear me?
This is Kevin Grody with the Missouri Basin Water Management Office.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Okay. We are increasing releases from Garrison from 52,000 to 60,000. But we are not increasing right now releases from Oahe. We are going to be storing that extra water in Oahe. We will be increasing Oahe releases several weeks down the road when we begin the evacuation of all the stored floodwaters. And we will have all that information. It is available on our website. So if anybody needs information, Doug, just have them contact me directly.
Okay. I will do. Thank you very much, Kevin. Okay, and that's pretty much all we have. Is anybody want to make any comments here in the room on anything? Any other questions from the audience? Of course, if you have our emails, you can always ping us at any time. And if you have any questions for the Corps and you don't know Kevin Grody's email, you can send them to me and I'll get them to the Corps one way or the other. And on that note, I want to thank everybody. We'll be back in July to give another summary of the conditions across a huge part of the U.S. So thank you very much, everyone, and talk to you next month.